This is BBC Radio 3. It's just after 9:30 now, and time for Landscape with Figure, this week's Sunday feature. On the 60th anniversary of the D-Day landings, Sean Street retraces the short life of the soldier-poet Keith Douglas.
Remember me when I am dead, and simplify me when I'm dead. As the processes of earth strip off the colour and the skin, take the brown hair and blue eye, and leave me simpler than at birth, when hairless I came howling in, as the moon came in the cold sky. Of my skeleton, perhaps, so stripped, a learned man will say, he was of such a type and intelligence, no more.
He wrote Simplify Me When I'm Dead when he was in military training, probably fairly shortly before he was going abroad, and I suspect it's written in answer to Brooke. That generation walked around with, if I should die, think only this of me, Rupert Brooke stuck in their heads.
Thus, when in a year collapse particular memories, you may deduce from the long pain I bore, the opinions I held, who was my foe, and what I left, even my appearance, but incidents will be no guide.
All memory is simplification. You simply do not remember anybody as they were. But we remember him as a poet, and we have a concept of him that lives with us, in us. And that's quite enough. It's better than having the whole man. The whole man was a difficult man. Let's remember the best of him.
Time's wrong-way telescope will show a minute man 10 years hence, and by distance simplified. Through that lens, see if I seem substance or nothing, of the world deserving mention or charitable oblivion.
I think he would like to be thought of as a good soldier, which he was, a good leader, and kind one.
Not by momentary spleen or love into decision hurled, leisurely arrive at an opinion. Remember me when I am dead, and simplify me when I'm dead.
I think that expresses the premonition and the certainty that he would be remembered.
He longed for simplicity. He felt he was too complicated.
Some thoughts on Keith Douglas and one of his most famous poems by Desmond Graham, his biographer, John Bethell-Fox and Stuart Hills, both fellow tank commanders in his regiment, the Sherwood Rangers, and the poet Anne Stevenson. 60 years on, I want to look down time's wrong-way telescope in an attempt to explore Douglas. The glass, the lens, it's a recurring image in his writing, observing sometimes in situations of great stress with a precision and a clarity which makes him the outstanding poet of the Second World War. His remains are buried here, in a small military cemetery near the village of Tilly-sur-Seulles, near Bayeux. This is a place to start in search of a man and a collection of work that belongs to a past war, but speaks with a remarkably contemporary voice. His stone records that Captain K.C. Douglas was a poet and artist, and adds, these things he loved, he died in their defence. It tells us, too, that he died on the 9th of June 1944, at the age of 24.
I don't think many war poets are naturally soldiers, and it seems to me that Keith Douglas had a military mind. Maybe he inherited from his father. Certainly he modelled himself on soldiers, so that he didn't feel that literature and soldiering conflicted at all. When he began writing poems as a very young boy, age 14, he was already mustering his lines like a regiment. And his impulse as an artist, and also as a visual artist, was to make something orderly.
His father had served in the First World War, won the MC, I think very much lived in the past of his martial days. We don't know much about him, but certainly from the little Keith's point of view, went marching round the garden, made himself a military cap badge out of an old button.
He writes, for example, an autobiographical short story when he's young.
Poet Tim Kendall, who's currently working on a book about war poetry.
I think he writes it at something like the age of 12. It begins, as a child he was a militarist. And he does write several war poems, you might call them, even before war in Europe.
The strange thing, looking back over the passage of time, is the extent to which intimations of war were around and present. The wonderful poem he wrote on leaving school, it's talking about being happy while we can, and that's a poem of 1938, summer, but his eye and his ear are open to his immediate environment.
When Douglas went up to Oxford in 1938, his tutor at Merton College was Edmund Blunden, himself a poet of the First World War. With his support and encouragement, Keith began seeking outlets for his poetry and was published in the Oxford and Cambridge magazine Fords and Bridges, for which the Oxford editor was John Hall.
We both edited magazines at around that time and printed each other's work, but we didn't actually meet all that often. He didn't really want to meet writers up there very much. He was a more sporty character. He enjoyed riding and so on. But from the beginning, I was extremely impressed by his poetry at that time, which seemed to be vastly better than anything else that was being written up there, or anywhere else for that matter.
This is actually a picture of Ying Cheng in the poem The Prisoner. Today, Cheng, I touched your face with 2 fingers as a gesture of love. It's a Chinese girlfriend from Oxford.
Today, Cheng, I touched your face with 2 fingers as a gesture of love. For I can never prove enough by sight or sense your strange grace. But mothwise my hands return to your fair cheek, as luminous as a lamp in a paper house, and touch to teach love and learn. I think 100 hours are gone that so like gods we'd occupy, but alas, Cheng, I cannot tell why.
He ends up, today I touched a mask stretched on the stone-hard face of death.
There was the urge to break the bright flesh and emerge from the ambitious cruel burn.
So in the 40s, the interest in death was a kind of fashionable literary trope. As we get further from the period, we realise that so many of those allusions and references are about their own fears and anxieties.
I think he looked at the world to a certain extent from the outside, from above. Some people would say he wasn't involved enough, that he was rather remote. But in a poem like Canoe, well, he's very much there. It's a very personal poem.
Canoe is a very good example of a poem written after the start of the war in 1940, although before Douglas has gone off from Oxford to Officer Training College. And it posits the death of the poet so that Douglas says in a year's time he'll be coming back to this idyllic scene in Oxford as a revenant.
Well, I am thinking this may be my last summer, but cannot lose even a part of pleasure in the old-fashioned art of idleness. I cannot stand aghast at whatever doom hovers in the background, while grass and buildings and the somnolent river, who know they are allowed to last forever, exchange between them the whole subdued sound of this hot time. What sudden fearful fate can deter my shade wandering next year from a return? Whistle, and I will hear, and come another evening when this boat travels with you alone towards Iffley, as you lie looking up the thunder again. This cool touch does not betoken rain. It is my spirit that kisses your mouth lightly. That's a beautiful poem. Now that is a lyrical poem, but it's also a dramatic poem. But the sense of the poem flows like the river right through the stanzas. So you almost forget that this really is a poem that anticipates his death.
In his second year at Oxford, What he starts to develop is this theatrical, ballet, stage play, magician, transformation, all these, in general, more romantic ingredients. Actually, the sort of romantic ingredients more associated with a German romanticism.
They're Shakespearean, actually. One would say that the theatrical aspect of his poems seems to me very much all the world's a stage. We live our lives in roles, as if society was giving us the play we were acting in. We're sort of handed a period of life in which we live our lives, and then we exit.
If we only had Douglas's poems up to the Middle East or up to before he went into action, which after all is the case with Sidney Keyes, it is the case with Drummond Allison, he would still, I'm sure, be remembered and seen as a poet of enormous promise. And he would be seen as a poet of the war malaise, the doom, the gloom, youthful fears of death. I think Douglas would be among others, but not standing out there preeminent.
From July 1940 to June 1941, he underwent military training. He considered the uniform most handsome and sardonically doctored his passing out picture with a halo and the inscription Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, after Wilfred Owen, quoting from the Odes of Horace, "To die for the fatherland is a sweet thing and becoming." He joined the Sherwood Rangers, a cavalry regiment modernised for tank warfare, and sailed for the Middle East in July 41. Immediately he seems to have caused ripples in the accepted scheme of military hierarchies. This was the soldier, impatient for experience, who was to desert his post as a camouflage officer to seek action at the Battle of El Alamein. Stuart Hills and John Bethell-Fox.
He was rather different, in my view, from most of the officers, because he had the appearance of a cavalry officer without the bearing or the manner of a regular cavalry officer. I felt he was not quite at home.
He was a bit of a bolshie. He had a sort of, well, not a bolshie reputation exactly, but he wasn't the most difficult person for a regiment like the Sherwood Rangers, which, I mean, a lot of them were sort of Etonians and big landowners and God knows what, you know, and here comes this chap who thinks nothing of that sort of thing. You haven't got any brains between you, you know. So that's why he's probably on a limb a bit.
Connected with his attitude to his senior officers, I always felt that he looked at them as if they were some different kind of species, and he was trying to work out what made them tick. So he observed them rather as one would observe a blue tit or some attractive bird one didn't know much about.
Aristocrats. The noble horse with courage in his eye, clean in the bone, looks up at a shell burst. Away fly the images of the shires, but he puts the pipe back in his mouth. Peter was unfortunately killed by an 88. It took his leg away. He died in the ambulance. I saw him crawling on the sand. He said, "It's most unfair. They've shot my foot off." How can I live among this gentle, obsolescent breed of heroes and not weep? Unicorns almost, for they are fading into two legends in which their stupidity and chivalry are celebrated. Each fool and hero will be an immortal. These plains were their cricket pitch, and in the mountains the tremendous drop fences brought down some of the runners. Here then, under the stones and earth, they dispose themselves, I think with their famous unconcern. It is not gunfire I hear, but a hunting horn.
When he had first experienced action, he started to try to write about it, and the first one or two poems are quite clearly like Sassoon, particularly the poem Gallantry, the colonel in a casual voice addressing the troops in the microphone, and then they're all going to die. That kind of satire, the irony of war. He was writing under the shadow of the protest poetry of the First War.
Here are these English public school boys who just out of Eton or Harrow, they've never in their lives thought about death or life or anything like that. And here they are, shot to pieces in the desert. And he sees the irony of it. It's so useless.
Now, when he got writing, he doesn't turn to Sassoon, but of course Rosenberg. Rosenberg, he says in Desert Flowers, Rosenberg, I only repeat what you were saying. The shell and the hawk every hour are slaying men, and your boas slaying the mind. What happens to that human flame when you're killed? When he sees the dead, and the first subject of his war poems was the dead. Douglas, looking at the dead men, sees actors, dolls, corpses. It's the transition, the move from being living to being dead. It's the creative, regenerating mind giving way to the useless material, ruined body.
And the mystery there, which Desmond Graham articulates, was often perceived in Keith Douglas's own creative mind in terms of the surreal. Surrealism was much in the poetic air in the late 30s and early 40s, through, among others, the work of David Gascoigne, whom Douglas admired. But long before that, another Oxford man, Charles Ludwig Dodgson, had created perhaps the ultimate surrealist adventure.
One of the few books Douglas has with him in the North African campaign is Lewis Carroll, Alice Through the Looking Glass, and Douglas describes going into battle as being like going through the looking glass into this crazy world where you have to kill people and they have to kill you, and it suddenly seems so unreal or surreal to find yourself in those circumstances. At the end of Cairo Jack, there's the horrific image of a man with no head has a packet of chocolate and a souvenir of Tripoli. What does a man with no head need least of all? Souvenir of Tripoli, and of course even more so the packet of chocolate. How is he going to eat this chocolate? And it's the most grotesque joke in the most horrific circumstances, and it's what gives that poem the little kick at the end. So it's not just about the pity of war, it's also about the absurdity and even the comedy of war.
And I've got a couple of books here. What would he have in July 43, having just been fighting against the Germans, but Rilke? What would he have here? This is another book Mrs. Douglas gave to me. Blackwell's German Texts. And the third one I got here is actually very precious. This is Nietzsche's Also sprach Zarathustra, and it belonged to, I think it's probably Hasenkamp, Walter Hasenkamp, a book which was referred to in Allemagne Zemzem as being found by him in a weapon pit with what he calls the Nazi passages underlined, and there's the underlining there.
He's a poet who's absolutely fascinated with ways in which we see and the morality of seeing. For instance, you take the sniper in How to Kill, who's looking through his dial of glass at the unfortunate German.
In How to Kill, the crucial thing for which he's so well known is writing a poem about killing and saying, I am amused to see the centre of love diffused, the waves of love travel into vacancy. How easy it is to make a ghost. Unlike almost all the writing of the First War, in there writing about the soldier as killer. But of course in the manuscripts we discover what he wrote was how easy it is to be a ghost.
How to Kill. Under the parabola of a ball, a child turning into a man, I looked into the air too long. The ball fell in my hand, it sang in the closed fist, open, open, behold a gift designed to kill. Now in my dial of glass appears the soldier who is going to die. He smiles and moves about in ways his mother knows, habits of his. The wires touch his face. I cry, now. Death, like a familiar, hears, and look, has made a man of dust, of a man of flesh. This sorcery I do. Being damned, I am amused to see the centre of love diffused and the waves of love travel into vacancy. How easy it is to make a ghost. The weightless mosquito touches her tiny shadow on the stone, and with how like, how infinite a lightness man and shadow meet. They fuse. A shadow is a man when the mosquito death approaches.
And the awareness of killing is caught up in the awareness of dying.
It ends with this beautiful image, delicate image of death as being like a mosquito bite. And he talks about the way in which the shadow and the man meet at the point of death. It's very delicate after the brutality of what's gone before. I think for me that's what makes that particular poem so successful.
And there was a story Mrs. Douglas told me that has always stuck in my mind, which was when Keith was a little boy, I think he was 5 or 6, having an injection. She was astonished to see that he stared as the needle went into his arm. So he was someone who couldn't stop looking, who kept his eyes open. He wanted to know what it looked like. He uses in one of his poems that image of doubting Thomas, of the person returning to the battlefield, and you like Thomas come to poke fingers in the wounds.
Douglas is obsessed with doing something different from what Owen in particular and the other First World War poets do. And one of the ways in which he's certainly different from Owen is the dispassion of his gaze. He describes his style as extrospective. He's not interested in telling the reader how he feels about things. He's interested in presenting, as he describes it, fairly simple photographs of what he has witnessed.
Douglas sketched his thinking about war in his prose work chronicling the Middle East campaign, Alamein to Zemzem. As a poet, there was now no going back to a previous world. He was an existentialist as well as a pragmatist. Writing to John Hall, he speaks of hoping for a better world as being criminally foolish as it is to stop working for it. And he goes on, "It sounds silly to work without hope. It doesn't mean work hopelessly." He was an artist as well as a poet, and the images in his drawings for Alamein to Zemzem, as shown to Stuart Hills, a new recruit to the Sherwood Rangers, were as honest and graphic as those in his words.
I mean, they were pretty good stuff. I mean, I could see straight away that here was an artist of great measure. And they are grotesque, some of these drawings. And I thought to myself, well, this is war as seen. And I think he himself wanted to show people through these drawings, and obviously through his poetry as well, the indescribable awfulness of the whole business.
He's been labelled by some people as a tough guy, and this is based more on his desire to be very direct and no nonsense and so on. But I think this tough guy image is something of a mask, actually. I think he was a very sensitive person. I don't mean that he was dishonest, far from it. But I think that anybody who thinks of him in those terms is making a mistake.
He had an immense capacity, I think, for compassion. And that comes over in these poems, even though they're very stern and completely unsentimental. Completely unsentimental. How does he do it? Most people, when they're compassionate, melt all over the place. And that's what you want from poetry. You don't want to feel that the poet is succumbing to his own emotions.
I always remember how in Alamein to Zemzem, his prose memoir, when he uses the word pity on seeing a dead soldier, he says, "It filled me with useless pity." Useless pity. And I think Douglas is very suspicious of the purposes of pity. Who does pity benefit? Is it merely to make ourselves feel noble? He doesn't want to indulge in his own emotional reaction. He wants to tell the reader how it is and let the reader decide. As a result, he can appear brutal.
3 weeks gone and the combatant's gone, returning over the nightmare ground, we found the soldier sprawling in the sun. It's the language of, as Wordsworth would have said, a man talking to men. He manages to write in a modern, in a new, in an up-to-date way, still up-to-date, because it's the language we're all still speaking.
Vergiss mich nicht. 3 weeks gone and the combatant's gone, returning over the nightmare ground, we found the place again, and found the soldier sprawling in the sun, the frowning barrel of his gun overshadowing. As we came on that day, he hit my tank with one like the entry of a demon. Look, here in the gun-pit spoil, the dishonoured picture of his girl who has put Steffi, vergiss mich nicht, in a copybook Gothic script. We see him almost with content abased, and seeming to have paid and mocked at by his own equipment that's hard and good when he's decayed. But she would weep to see today how on his skin the swart flies move, the dust upon the paper eye, and the burst stomach like a cave. For here the lover and killer are mingled, who had one body and one heart, and death, who had the soldier singled, has done the lover mortal hurt.
There's a tension always between the lover and the killer, between the man of action and the man of pleasure. But of course, that's the kind of thing that makes poetry. You have to have that kind of clash.
There was this letter that he wrote me in August 1943 from Palestine, where he was recovering from his wounds. He was rather renouncing his early work, saying it didn't matter a great deal, and he was moving on to a new style. And I apparently was doubtful about this new style, although later on, of course, I came to appreciate it.
I suppose, like any war poet, he has the challenge of making something finished, artificial, polished, as a poem is, out of horror, violence, death, blood, and the struggle, the tension in which the form is under in Douglas is extreme at times, and at times the form breaks, so that you can see from the drafts, for example, that the poem starts off as being perfectly rhymed and ends up in the final version. You can just about detect the rhymes from time to time, but there's often a working away from the perfection of the form to something far less perfect.
Where he gained, I think, was that in his later work he opened up his work rhythmically more. It flows more. He didn't write free verse. If you look at the poems carefully, they're all rhymed, or most of them are rhymed. But he did loosen up the work, and perhaps this was the way he would have gone after the war if he'd survived.
There's complete mastery of sound and pattern without going to Wilfred Owen's orchestration. It's, as he said he wanted, significant speech.
It's the lightness allied to strength in Keith Douglas's significant speech that makes him so different from Wilfred Owen's weight and density. In a poem called Words, Douglas gives us an appraisal of his own technique. There are those who capture them in hundreds, keep them prisoners in black bottles, release them at exercise and clap them back. But I keep words only a breath of time, turning in the lightest of cages, uncover and let them go. Sometimes they escape forever. It's impossible to improve on Ted Hughes's assessment of the technique in his introductory essay to the collected poems, in which he writes of a fine-spun, intricate steeliness, like the structure of a flying insect, all cantilever tension and balance, a flexing of minute precisions, iridescent but definite, and at the same time like the skeleton of a small, transparent, deep-sea fish that withstands giant pressures.
He was conscious of his own technical, poetic craft. He had a way of, I think of it as knowing the weight of every word he used. It's a mastery of pace and tone. And he had that from the beginning, and he always had it, straight through.
For me as a poet, my favourite poem would be Mercer, because it is so effortless and subtle and only really comes round to the war at the end through these wonderful near rhymes.
He sort of takes it like a picture. He puts this bit in and that bit in, and in a way the sounds echo back and forth the way colours do in a painting. This blue half-circle of sea, moving transparently on sand as pale as salt, was Cleopatra's hotel. That sand as pale as salt, all those A's, he lays them out like paving stones. Here is a guest house built and broken utterly since. An amorous modern prince lived in this scoured shell. Now from the skeletal town, the cherry-skinned soldiers stroll down to undress, to idle on the white beach. Cherry-skinned soldiers is magnificent, because of course they're reddened by the sun. But cherry-skinned also has a sense of cherries and fruit and abundance. And here's the skeletal town with the cherry-skinned soldiers and idle on the white beach. And then you hold the sound of beach in your head. There's a little parenthesis. Up there, the immensely long road goes by to Tripoli. The wind and dust reach the secrets of the whole poor town. And whole comes at the end of the line. You have to take that enjambment there. The whole poor town, whose masks would still deceive a passer-by. Faces with sightless doors for eyes, with cracks like tears oozing at the corners. A dead tank alone leans where the gossips stood. I see my feet like stones underwater. The logical little fish converge and nip the flesh, imagining I am one of the dead. Well, simply an amazing poem.
In December 1943, Douglas was back in England as the Sherwood Rangers prepared for D-Day. The 6 months left gave him the opportunity of developing plans for the publication of his poems and Alamein to Zemzem with Tambimutu's Poetry London editions, as well as ideas for a new work, which he'd considered calling Landscape with Figures. It was his romantic relationship with Tambimutu's assistant Betty Jess, which seems to have by chance given him a stranger, darker title.
He was mainly, to begin with, very concerned about his book. He wanted this published before he then finally came out that he thought he knew he was going to be killed. And I used to rot him up about that. I said, don't be silly. Well, I mean, what do you say? Oh, yes, you're going to be killed. Oh, really? Yes, I see, you know. I found this arrogance sometimes slightly irritating, so I began to call him my bête noire. And this, I didn't realize that it had opened up something inside his mind to a terrifying extent, because he really took it very seriously and did these drawings of this beast on his back, you know.
He talks about producing a book called Bête Noire, which will include poems, prose, photographs, and drawings. And you can see that he has in mind a project which combines all these different genres to produce snapshots of the truth of war, or at least the truth of his war. And all that project seems to be part of the same thing, of buttonholing the audience and saying, look at this, this is what it was like, this is what I had to do to protect you, to defend you, this is what you expected me to do. And similarly, when he says look to the audience, when he's pointing the gun at another soldier and saying, this is how I kill someone, he's incriminating us in that act. So that if we turn away, if we're queasy, if we're squeamish about it, we're somehow morally negligent, because after all he's pulling that trigger or taking the snap, the photographic image, for us.
He used to say very often that he was going to be killed. He was quite categorical about that. There was no mucking about it. I suppose perhaps instinctively I felt he really believed that he was going to be. which is very hard to bear from my point of view.
The beast is the shadow. It's the dark other, which is of course also the self. The feeling of one's carrying one's death around inside one.
I think inside him he sort of felt, I am an artist. I am a poet. I should know what I'm worth, but I don't think I do really recognise that I am quite somebody, which he was. This is why he was so fatalistic, I think, in many ways, because I think he probably felt, well, I've done what I was born into this world to do. There's not much more I can do, except, be heroic. Let me be a hero. He was pessimistic about anybody's chances, I think, of getting through. I mean, he sort of saw the whole thing.
Stuart Hills, Douglas and the Sherwood Rangers made their final preparations for D-Day in the New Forest, based at Sway. On the Sunday morning before the regiment's departure, Padre Leslie Skinner set up an improvised communion service beside Keith Douglas's tank. As the Padre recalled, he was to see Keith Douglas again, later the same day.
Knowing it was the last Sunday before we left Sway, I'd agreed to take part in the evening service at the parish church. As the first hymn went on, a soldier in uniform came in and sat down, and looking up I realised it was Keith Douglas. And after the service was over, Keith was waiting outside and he asked if we could have a talk. I agreed, and we wandered about in the New Forest for a good deal of the night. We talked about everything under the sun and kept coming back to this business of he wasn't going to let the war out. This show would be his last.
There's a terrific little poem called To Christine, Yingcheng, Olga, Milena, four of his ex-girlfriends, where he talks about, here I give back perforce the sweet wine to the grape, give the dark plant its juices, what every creature uses by natural law will seep back to the natural source. It's as though he's preparing for his own departure from the earth and wanting to leave everything just the way he found it. It's a piece of housekeeping, tidying things up before he goes off to France and to what he assumes will be his death.
Douglas described the preparations for D-Day in the poem Actors Waiting in the Wings of Europe. And the stage he was about to step onto was here, Gold Beach at Arromanches. There's a cartoon he made too at the time, full of wry humour, shells with shark's teeth, Wigan gasworks descending on the enemy, a comic chaos far removed from the reality of the day that swallowed us all into the stomach of a war. From here they moved inland, and on the 9th of June, Keith Douglas and John Bethell-Fox stepped out of their tanks to recce some farm buildings.
We went off and did whatever we had to do, which was to try and identify some enemy movement. The other side of a small stream we were fired at. We had to get back as quickly as we could, and in the process he was slightly nicked in the leg by a bullet.
Bethell-Fox has this memory of having to cross a river at the point when a machine gunner started to fire at them, and they crouch in the bank safe.
And that's the first time I saw him scared, paralysed with fear. He was no longer in control of himself when this happened. And I'd never seen this before, and it impressed itself on my mind naturally. But he knew with absolute certainty that the day had come.
They swim up the river, cross at a different point where they'll be safe, and go up to the hedges where the tanks are hull down on the top of this hill, point 103.
And we rejoined the squadron where it was on top of a hill, and he was killed by a mortar which went off when he got out of his tank.
Why do you want to go and recce on foot and do something absurd like that? I suppose he and John Bethell-Fox felt that, they ought to show us how it should be done. But he was totally irresponsible. He was second in command of the squadron.
And the Padre came and buried him the next day.
I went from the leading tank to where I could see Keith partly lying in the field. He was dead, and I dealt with the corpse in the usual way, stitched him up in a blanket. But there was no mark, no blood, no anything on Keith Douglas. Things quieted down, and I called up 2 of my crew to come and help me dig the grave. Within a few yards of where he had been killed.
And using Padre Skinner's map, sketched in June 44 to enable the location and reburial of fallen troops, I've come to a place which matches his description of where Douglas was killed, in fields outside the village of Odrio, looking across a wide, low valley, with the rooftops of St Pierre just visible. Inevitably the landscape has changed. Hedgerows in the drawing have since disappeared, but as far as I can work out, this is the place where the death Keith Douglas had so often foreseen through the lens of his poetry finally happened. A death predicted one last time in his final poem, On a Return from Egypt. To stand here in the wings of Europe disheartened, I have come away from the sick land where in the sun lay the gentle, slow-eyed murderers of themselves, exquisites under a curse, here to exercise my depleted fury.
For the heart is a coal, growing colder, when jewelled cerulean seas change into grey rocks, grey water fringe, sea and sky altering like a cloth, till colour and sheen are gone both. Cold is an opiate of the soldier.
And all my endeavours are unlucky explorers come back, abandoning the expedition.
The specimens, the lilies of ambition, still spring in their climate, still unpicked.
But time is all I lacked to find them.
As the great collectors before me.
You've got his tremendous assertion of his being one of the great collectors, one of the great writers.
He knew he was probably the only poet of the Second War who would last and who would be considered one of the great poets.
But time is all I lacked to find them, as the great collectors before me.
Time is all I lacked.
The next month, then, is a window.
And with a crash I'll split the glass.
With a crash, I'll split the glass. Douglas never dies passively. He crashes through glass to see what will be on the other side.
Behind it stands one I must kiss.
Person of love or death?
A person or a wraith.
And his last line is, I fear what I shall find. I think the important thing about that line is, I fear what I shall find. So what he's fearing is, of course, his own death.
I fear what I shall find.
There doesn't really seem to be a doubt as to what he's going to find.
For a man of 24 to have written these poems is almost miraculous. I think every poet who has studied him has learned from him, and with a certain awe, keeps him in a very special place. The book on a very special shelf in the mind.
The poet Anne Stevenson with a final thought on the poetry of Keith Douglas. Others taking part in Landscape with Figure were the poets J.C. Hall and Tim Kendall, Douglas biographer Desmond Graham, D-Day veteran Stuart Hills, and recordings from the BBC Sound Archives of another old comrade, John Bethell-Fox, Padre Leslie Skinner, and Douglas's last girlfriend, Betty Jessie. The programme was presented by Sean Street, and the producer was Alan Hall. Landscape with Figure was an Alan Hall Associates production for BBC Radio 3.